It is not yesterday's future. Reimagining tomorrow's destinations, coming up live shortly. Hi, welcome to Convex Hub channel. I'm Bonnie Redzon, your host for Expert Insight at Live, a broadcast series featuring forums and interviews with industry thought leaders on market, policy, strategy, technology, and innovation that steer the industry growth. To all our viewers, if you have any inquiries or questions, kindly share them on Slido, #Hospitality Expert Insight at Live. You can also post your questions through the Q&A message box below the live broadcast channel. Prior to the pandemic, tourism growth in Asia was outperforming much of the world. New destinations were being developed, creative experiences were designed, and large and small innovative enterprises were being created. But now, everything has changed. I have with me today two of the most renowned tourism reimagining experts. First, we have Professor Dr. Walter Jamieson, FCIP RPP, Adjunct Professor, Hospitality and Tourism Management of Ryerson University, and Ms. Michelle Jamieson, Communication and Change Consultant, to share the insights and thoughts on how destination planners and designers could reimagine tomorrow's destination with inspiration to imagine a better normal that creates new experiences, protects the environment, provides development opportunities for all stakeholders involved in tourism activities, and adheres to the SDGs. The discussion today will be moderated by Mr. Michael I. Waits, founder of Metlic Partners, Blockchain Labs.ai, and Michael Waits Media. Without further ado, I will now hand over the segment to you, Michael.
Hi, this is Michael Waits. I would like to thank Convex Hub for letting me moderate today's discussion. This should be a really interesting one, actually, entitled "It is Not Yesterday's Future, Reimagining Tomorrow's Destinations." Our guests today are, again, Professor Walter Jamieson, Adjunct Professor at Ryerson University and the Chief Innovation Officer at Green Door Solutions, and Michelle Jamieson. I feel like they've met each other before, actually. Communication and Change Consultant at Green Door Solutions. Thank you both very much for coming and doing this today. It's great to see you again.
Thanks, Michael. We're very happy to be joining everyone this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, so we wanted to start this afternoon to discuss with you reimagining tomorrow's destinations. Reimagining your destination is no small endeavor, and so what we're going to present are a number of concepts that individually are important considerations, but collectively empower you to make meaningful, efficient, and lasting change to your destination. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jamieson. With 40 plus years of progressive work in education, heritage, tourism, and the creative industries, Dr. Jamieson utilizes and employs tangible and sustainable planning approaches to his work across the globe with a focus in Asia for the past 4 decades.
Thank you, Michelle. Again, I would like to echo Michael's thanks to Convex Hub for asking us to participate in this webinar. It's certainly a pleasure to do so. I would like to introduce Michelle. As Michael says, I do know her a little bit. We've all heard it before, that change is inevitable, but for Michelle, this has been the case since she started her career. Michelle has a strong background in tourism and hospitality with a focus on communications. She has a master's degree in change management and has been active in Canada, the United States, and Southeast Asia. Her experience ranges from acting as a consultant on several projects in Southeast Asia to being the head of PR and communications for a major Asia-based hotel chains. She recognizes the importance of sharing her experience and has participated in the development of a number of publications. We've been doing all kinds of work across Southeast Asia and through India and China. We work from the local destination right up to the international stage, doing tourism plans, marketing strategies, training, facilitating change and change processes. We always feel that one of our objectives is to really present ideas and concepts in different ways, always with the objective of making our work user-friendly and applicable to practicing professionals and the overall community. When we were putting together this webinar, the organizers asked us to identify a series of key ideas that would help destination planners and designers to take advantage of new opportunities that will present themselves, as well as address the significant challenges facing our industry. We recognize that some topics will need to be explored in other forums, given time constraints. Our presentation has a great many ideas and concepts. In some cases, you might want to refer back to the PowerPoints, which will be available after the forum. We are, of course, always there to assist you when necessary. We thought it would be useful as we begin our presentation today to identify some key ideas around which our presentation is organized. And they are the following: the idea that we must be resilient and sustainable in our work, that we must be innovative in the approaches that we take as we look towards the future, that we must rely on a data-driven approach to planning and design. We stress collaboration and teamwork as an essential element of working towards the future, and we think that integrated and multidisciplinary approaches are absolutely essential as we move towards the future. We push the idea of strategic thinking, and we'll deal with this in more detail later. We feel that all of us will need to be able to deal with uncertainty in an effective way and be led by visions that are the product of stakeholder agreement. While many destinations are still struggling to recover from the pandemic, the time is right from our point of view to begin to adopt the right planning processes and strategies that involve the right people using the right techniques and tools.
Some of us may be missing what normal used to be, and that's understandable. But we are now in a position to learn from what was or was not working in the past and explore how to take advantage of the opportunity to make changes for the better, for a more sustainable destination with more accessibility and inclusivity. And we discuss various aspects of planning for the future. It is with this notion of harnessing the opportunity to take a second, to evaluate and put into place, to Dr. Jameson's point, the right strategies, integrating the right people. In order to deal with this new normal, the question is, what kind of change needs to happen in order for destinations to be successful in navigating this new normal? While we see the current disruption as an opportunity to reimagine the future, it is important to note that the changes that will happen will be based on an incremental innovation in some cases, while other situations will require a more radical vision and larger structural change to governance models, experience design, and stakeholder engagement. We're not advocating to reinvent the wheel, but build on the strategies that worked in the past using a lens of the new future to allow for opportunities to introduce new ways of doing things. The pause that the pandemic has required us to take is actually a good time to reevaluate your vision. As some destinations begin this evaluation, some may notice that over the years, they have deviated from their original vision, or even working towards multiple directions. Given the uncertain times, it is more important now than ever to ensure that there is one clear direction, which will be the guide to develop or reimagine the approaches, policies, and activities. This will be a difficult task that will require well thought out engagement approaches and a process of collaboration where stakeholders are able to buy into a new vision. Pre-COVID, over-tourism was the primary issue facing many destinations, and we have moved into a state of under-tourism. Our next step is looking to the future to determine how our destinations are going to look. If you want to use your crystal ball, as you may have in the past, you will find that the picture is not so clear and it may not be helpful as you try to reimagine what the future looks like. It would be unreasonable at this point to begin to suggest with any level of specific detail how tourism market segments will evolve or what expectation of experiences they will have. It is possible to look at the research to what the research is suggesting and the trends that tourism experts have identified for the future, which are actually not new. However, they will take on a different level of importance, such as the attention and expectation of safety and security for travelers as it relates to their health. It is suggested that visitors will be looking for wellness and health experiences. No doubt, authenticity will play a role, which is often built around local experiences. The pandemic has clearly shown us the fragility of the globe, and most tourists will be more conscious of the sustainable dimensions of a destination.
So we've designed this presentation to allow you to reimagine your destination. We can't start a discussion about the future without carefully considering sustainable development and ensuring that it is incorporated throughout the decision-making and implementation process. All of our work over the last many years has been involved in pushing the concept of sustainable and responsible tourism. At this time of the pandemic, we would not want to forget the importance of the UN Sustainable Development Goals as part of the overall planning process. We must begin to ensure that we measure tourism success by the improvement in the lives of residents, the protection of the environment, and the preservation of culture and heritage through tourism development. We would like to stress that one key dimension is to develop metrics that measure the positive impacts of tourism on a number of variables, such as the creation of jobs for women, a decrease in poverty, opportunities for Indigenous people, and many other factors that we could discuss. And furthermore, we feel very strongly that we must move away from quantitative metrics, such as visitor arrivals, which tend to be a major factor used in measuring success in many Asian destinations, to ones that assess qualitative factors.
So we wanted to provide some context to help outline the different areas that we wanted to discuss this afternoon. There are a number of topics that we feel are essential in helping us to understand and reimagine the future. We start off by looking at uncertainty, which is going to be a constant theme for at least the short to medium term in our planning processes. Then we will examine the opportunities and challenges. Based on that examination, we have identified the need for a mindset change that will set us up to be more effective and deliberate in our abilities as we plan for the future. It will be up to you and your teams to determine the best tools and approaches to employ as you begin your journey of reimagining your destination, as no two destinations will be alike. The value of the factors presented on the previous slide are only seen as we bring them together. The framework here helps to illustrate this and allows us to understand how the various pieces fit together into a sustainable future. There are some cross-cutting themes and ideas such as mindset change, change management, and design thinking that are common to many of the key ideas in the overall reimagining process. Integration is quite clearly necessary if we are going to come out of the pandemic successfully. Many people fear change, and in fact, will fight any attempt to change the way things are done. We would argue that we need to welcome change and take advantage of the unexpected. For some destinations, this will be challenging and may require outside professional assistance to help in the change process. There are well-recognized change management approaches and concepts that are of particular importance to destination planning and management.
We always like to start off our planning and design work by identifying a number of key questions that we think are particularly important and that we wish to answer. And we would suggest that that's something that all of you might want to consider as you're moving through. Here are some key questions that we've identified, and hopefully they may be of use to you. First, and not surprisingly, is how is your destination going to achieve sustainability? What kind of strategies and approaches will you be taking to ensure that your destination is able to pass the resources, the images, the possibilities on to future generations? What opportunities do you feel that you have in your destination that have been untapped and could become an important part of your future? Who do you think your visitors are going to be? And what do you think their needs are going to be? Who do you think you're going to require in terms of your workforce? What kind of skills and knowledge do you think they will require? How do we resolve the issue that I just talked about in terms of quality over quantity? In many of the places we've worked, politicians typically like to use quantity, i.e. international arrivals or level of visitor spend, as their major metrics. And we would argue these are in no way in keeping with the kind of sustainable principles that we think are important. We like to think of the triple bottom line as something that we can achieve over a period of time in our destinations. We strongly believe in the power of tourism to alleviate poverty, to stimulate economic growth. How can your destination use tourism to improve the well-being of the people in the destination itself? And finally, how do we govern ourselves in the future? Well, with that set of questions, we then want to better understand the opportunities and challenges facing us. We feel that these are essential elements of the reimagining process. Most of these are well known to you, but it's useful to look at these in terms of your own destination and how to take advantage of the opportunities and deal with the challenges. For example, what impact will climate change have on your destination? What role will the sharing economy in the form of Airbnb have on your accommodation sector? What is the carrying capacity of your destination? A major issue that really caused significant problems in terms of over-tourism pre-pandemic. And so we would always encourage destinations to think about the factors that will affect them in terms of their overall approach to their planning and design.
This diagram outlines an evolution from the old normal to the reimagined future. We can build on the processes and structures that were in place during the old normal. It is a matter of reevaluating and exploring what is needed for the reimagined future. As mentioned previously, this doesn't mean that you throw everything out the window and start new, but that is an option. But rather, we think that the present situation is allowing us to create a better normal that will meet the new needs of the tourists and our community in a sustainable way. This kind of examination allows us to reimagine the future based on the past, the present, and a set of normative views of a better normal. In this recent research from McKinsey, executives have identified that there are going to be significant impacts for the future. The research indicates that 90% of most executives agree that COVID-19 will fundamentally change the way they do business over the next 5 years. 85% are of the opinion that the crisis will have a lasting impact on their customers' needs and wants. And interestingly, only 20% felt that they had the necessary resources and commitment to pursue the new opportunities. That's pretty sobering, but important to consider, as resources and readiness for change will be vital to the success of achieving the most valuable future.
With that in mind, we first look at complexity. And as planners and designers, we recognize that complexity is an essential part of working towards the future. But our job as planners and designers is to make complexity accessible and understandable to all stakeholders. Without this, it becomes a concept that is poorly understood within the communities in which we work. In tourism, we frequently talk about the tourism system, but when we are developing strategies and designs, we seem to forget that we are working in an environment that requires that we understand and consider all parts of the system if we are to be effective and if we are to achieve the full potential of tourism as a tool for development.
And an important aspect of understanding how systems function is to consider the forces of change that are at work in all destinations. Done systematically, this provides an excellent framework for considering the future. Destinations have mostly relied on master and strategic plans to guide the future. Many were never implemented, a result of their long-term outlook on the changing business, social, and political realities. Given the challenges that we are facing today, we would advocate that the time is right to move towards a process of strategic thinking that attempts to synthesize data, use human intuition in decision-making, and develops integrated approaches to the design, planning, and management of your destinations. And so in order to deal with uncertainty and complexity, adopting a more tactical approach to planning is a valuable shift to consider. Tactical planning attempts to introduce new ideas and new ways of doing things more effectively and efficiently. For an approach to be tactical, it needs to be agile, allowing data to drive decision-making. It needs to be lean in terms of the resources required, and it must be decentralized and flexible enough to remove barriers and not require significant government intervention.
When we look at some of the most innovative and creative thinkers, we found that many of them were using design thinking as a way of identifying and understanding problems and developing sustainable solutions. In many planning and design processes, the temptation is very often to quickly lock into what we think the problem is and what the solution is. Our position is that this does not provide us with the opportunity to re-examine our initial assumptions and approaches. And rarely is the assessment process and problem solving collaborative in nature, i.e. teams working together to determine what the problem is. We'd like to very briefly give you a sense of what design thinking is, and we think that it's incredibly important that at least you consider different ways of thinking than we have in the past. And we feel that this will provide for more creative and sustainable solutions. It all starts out with the team, usually the team working together to understand the nature of the problem, to empathize with the people that are there. What's the problem really mean to the residents, to the visitors, to others within the community? How can we help them to better understand the opportunities that are there? We then work to define the problem, again, in a team environment. And then, and most importantly, we then ideate, that we go through a process of looking at the problems and opportunities and solutions on an ongoing basis in a group situation until we can actually find a solution that we think works for the future. Once we've done that, in a design thinking way, we prototype. We actually design. It could be an experience, it could be the design in a community, and we actually test it out to see if it works. Because too often we do strategic plans without ever thinking about if this thing will actually work, and we test it only much later. And in a design thinking way, even once we've implemented it, we're constantly thinking and assessing it. I'd like to give you just a quick example of a non-tourism related design thinking approach. And work with me on this one. In a developing country, millions of children were dying because they were premature and there wasn't a way of helping them to achieve full maturity. So if you gave that problem to a doctor or healthcare worker, they might say that these babies require incubators. But incubators are very expensive. Many rural areas do not have electricity, and when the incubators break down, there's no one to fix them. And so they put together a group of multidisciplinary thinkers to come up with a solution, because clearly the incubator wasn't going to work. And so at first they identified the problem, which was really that these babies needed to be kept warm for a period of time until their systems matured. They didn't need an incubator. And so what they came up with is this very simple solution of a sleeping bag, which is heated by gel packs and it cost about $200, is reusable, and is well within the technology and understanding of the people that would use it. And it's saving numerous lives and demonstrates the power of thinking in a design thinking way. I'm sure you've heard about this, that we tend to work in silos, not only within tourism, but in many areas of planning and design. And often disciplines work on their own, often departments work independently. And what we've found is that rarely is there a systematic and system-wide approach to working collaboratively. In addition, we always find it curious that people, for various reasons in tourism, do not work effectively with stakeholders who often are essential in achieving tourism goals. We would argue we need to get rid of the silos. We know that sounds simple, but it's not. And it will be very difficult for many jurisdictions, and something that we can discuss at another time.
If one accepts that getting rid of silos is important, then understanding the nature of the destination management process is essential. This concept map indicates our understanding of how destinations are structured. We are certain you have your own way of understanding your destination, but it is important to at least consider all of these dimensions as one begins the planning and design process.
What we've done here, and I will only spend a second looking at it because of time, is begin to think about all the pieces that actually make up destination management. And we've written about this significantly in terms of beginning to understand how do we bring together the various interest stakeholders in solving our tourism problems. And as you can see, it goes from what would commonly be understood for tourism to areas as community economic development, dealing with social problems, dealing with heritage, and involving the private sector effectively in what we do.
And further to that, when it comes to stakeholders, some of the more obvious players in the decision-making process for a destination are usually at the top of our list, while others might not seem to have that direct influence. In order to ensure that our stakeholders are going to be an asset to the changes you need to make, consider mapping out your stakeholders to analyze their level of influence, their involvement, and identify if there may be potential opposition. To get stakeholders on board with your new vision for your destination, it is just as much about communication, education, visibility, as much it is about strategic alliance.
One of the things that we find is that we really have to work hard at working with these stakeholders that Michelle is talking about, who may not see themselves as part of the tourism system. And our job often is to convince them that not only are they essential in meeting tourism goals that will help their community prosper and provide new opportunities for young people and women, but that they themselves may benefit from working effectively with us. And a good example are educational institutions, hospitals, insurance companies, branding companies, a series of enterprises that, if they are part of the process, will not only benefit the destination management process, but themselves. At the beginning, I talked about data, and there is no doubt that we must be data-driven. No longer can we depend on poorly collected and analyzed information. As we move into this uncertain future, we need to have a clear understanding of our data needs, and you can see here the examples which I'm sure all of you would recognize as being essential. One problem that destination approaches have typically is that they work with a very limited set of data gathering and analytic techniques. And it's our view that the data world has changed tremendously, and there are now significant opportunities for better understanding our destinations and to address their challenges and opportunities. Obviously, we can't talk about all of these in detail today, but it is important to become aware of these various approaches. Some of them are fairly straightforward, while others require specialized expertise and knowledge. And one of the encouraging things is that most destinations are in places where community colleges and universities can help you in this process. And so we would argue that you need to move away from questionnaires and surveys as your only way of gathering information, that we need to look at focus groups as a way of understanding what key stakeholders feel. We need to spend more time observing behavior of our tourists and residents in order to better design the places we work in. We need to spend more time looking at what has happened in the past, looking at case studies. We need to use geographic systems, mapping, as Michelle talked about earlier, to understand the spatial dimensions of what goes on in a destination. We need to constantly be looking at trends and market analysis. We need to spend time in brainstorming and ideation as a form of data gathering and analysis. And we need to better understand the organizations in which we work and with whom we work to see how change can be effective. We now have looked at a number of contextual issues, quickly, we have to admit, and we'd like to look specifically at the umbrella term of placemaking and tourism. Much of the planning and design literature and the popular press have identified placemaking as an important element of the overall process of planning for the future. Unfortunately, it is not well understood in tourism destination planning. And this is curious from our perspective, since it was part of the original thinking about tourism planning, especially of the work of Claire Gunn in 1979 and Inskeep in 1991. We would like to spend a few minutes looking at what we think is an important concept in helping to provide a structure for the planning and reimagining process. Placemaking has many definitions, depending on your perspective. From our perspective, it is a process that allows designers and planners to work with tourism planners to define and help create successful destinations while respecting their sense of place and community values. There has been some important work done by a group in the United States called the Project for Public Spaces. And while this study was US-based, we have found that many of the ideas are relevant within the Asian context. What this work has done is provide us with an understanding of the complexity and possibility for creating better places. We always find it useful to use this concept as a way of helping destination determine what they would like their destination to look like in the future. You might find this framework useful in looking at your destination. So, to briefly wrap up placemaking, placemaking is really best understood as an enabling process that draws together the right people while activating a place for both the needs of the residents as well as the tourists. I want to look at 4 quick examples of placemaking and change. The first is from the city of Seoul in Korea, and we can see on the left there is a major expressway that was built over a river some time ago, and a decision was made by a very brave mayor to remove the expressway and reintroduce the river to the city. And on the right-hand side, you can see the success they've had, and this has now become a major tourism attraction, amenity for local people, and in fact has even helped to lower the temperature in that part of the city. But most of the placemaking we do is not of that order. In this example from Europe, we can see that you can alter the nature of the transportation system to improve the quality of life of residents as well as tourists. And we see this happening everywhere in North America and in Europe, where streets and underpasses and other aspects of the transportation system are being redesigned to provide for a better quality of life for residents and for the tourists. This is a very simple example. This comes from Montreal in Canada. And on the top, you see a commercial street that is fairly bleak and it was poorly populated. And with very simple design, planting of trees and changing the circulation system, it's now become a pleasant environment for walking that welcomes residents as well as shoppers. And finally, this would come under the tactical planning and design aspects, which requires very little funding and intervention. It involves recapturing spaces that have been devoted to cars and turning them into pleasant amenities for tourists as well as residents. So it's important that we begin to visualize the kind of changes that we can see in our destinations.
We now want to talk about innovation. So as we discussed earlier, in order for destinations to be successful and competitive in the future, they will have to innovate. When we discuss change, there is a need for an innovative mindset that is inspired, creative, analytic, utilizes technology in an appropriate way, and involves a team approach. The innovation process requires asking a number of questions. What are the specific elements we would use to examine our future markets? What kind of experiences are appropriate to a destination and the intended market segments? How should the destination be managed, and what partnerships should be considered? Then finally, and most importantly, how can the plans and policies actually be financed and implemented? Innovation requires you to think outside the box, and sometimes that just means coloring outside the lines.
We don't want to minimize how difficult it is to introduce innovation into the reimagining process. And there will be several obstacles to convincing major stakeholders within your organization or outside it that doing things in a different way are important. And we have to accept failure. We have to accept the fact that often the tactical things that we try may not work. It shouldn't be seen as failure. It should be seen as part of the process of developing good solutions. And so this is very much based on the fact that we can't be seen as losing face if we don't succeed, but that we're trying very hard to come up with the best possible solutions. And so in order to make that happen, as Michelle said, we need creative thinking, that there needs to be an encouragement of creative thinking, an encouragement to think outside the box, and in fact, a recognition of the importance of doing that. You obviously need access to resources, whether it's knowledge or expertise or access to relevant information. And without that, it becomes very, very hard to do innovation. And then finally, and most important, we would argue that there has to be motivation within the organization itself to support innovation. And that at times is hard. And that's where change management at times becomes essential to convince decision makers in an organization that they need to innovate and think outside the box. One area where we have found issues in convincing people and destinations to think outside the box is from where we were very much focused on producing products, and we understood that process very well. Now, there is enough evidence to suggest now within tourism in general that we don't deal with products anymore, but our job is to design, to curate experiences that will meet a variety of needs of the visitor. And it means that we have to understand the technology to make these things happen. We need to understand the business environment. We need to understand the needs of the visitor as well as the resident. And we need the ability to tell a strong story that will differentiate the destination from other places. One tool that we use in this process is customer journey mapping. We rely on this significantly now in our work. And the important lesson here is that experiences don't happen. They have to be planned, they have to be managed, they have to be curated. And this slide indicates the steps that can be taken in that process. It's important that the process of designing experiences is carried out within a strategic environment that ensures the involvement of all key stakeholders. We recognize that this is a topic unto itself that should be explored in another setting.
We now want to take the opportunity to explore an area that Dr. Jameson and I have done quite a bit of research in as it relates to effective planning and implementation, which is really focused on building the necessary skills and knowledge for those who are driving the planning and the design process. Our experience in research has indicated that there are 3 competency areas that are essential in destination planning and management. They are technical, soft management, and interdisciplinary competencies. The latter is incredibly important if we are to approach the destination process in a systems and design thinking way. We have developed more fine-grained understandings of these 3 competency areas, but given our time today, we have included the article exploring this topic further at the end of the presentation for further exploration.
Now, we'd just like to say that we understand that this is difficult to do. But our position is that unless we change the way we think, that we change the way we work, that change the way that we analyze data, we're not going to achieve the successes that we think are possible. And so part of the responsibility lies in educational institutions to better train new graduates. But we have to accept the fact that the vast majority of the workers in tourism will never go back to school. So we see the responsibility in part being set within organizations themselves, whether it's on-the-job training, whether it's specialized courses, whether it's travel programs. But what ways can you begin to help your staff retrain, retool, to be able to be much more effective in the future? And as I think all of us know, that most industries now are pushing this idea that soft management skills, that interdisciplinary work, that teamwork are going to be necessary conditions, not only for innovation, but for success in the future. So we come down now, we've gone through this pathway, and we now have to think about how do we manage our destinations. And in the past, our destination management organizations of one form or another have largely been marketing organizations. And for many years, this model worked. But now we're seeing that that no longer is sufficient. And so some destinations have adopted a management organization approach that allows them to think more broadly about all the things that are occurring in their organization. And they've actually identified themselves as management and marketing organizations. And others have said, we need to really become development organizations. We need to look for economic opportunities. We need to look for new ways that our destination can be much more competitive in the future. We know it's going to be difficult to convince people to do that, but without enlarging the perspective of your organization, it will be very hard to compete with other destinations. Some destinations have taken more radical approaches, such as in the case of London and Partners, which has brought together the city's economic, job creation, and tourism activities. NYC and Company has done very much the same thing, and there is increasing evidence that bringing these various functions together not only is efficient in terms of the use of resources, but effective in positioning destinations. These organizations recognize the symbiotic relationship between tourism and economic development. This is something for you to consider as your communities struggle to deal not only with tourism, but the larger community and economic development challenges that they face. It may not take on this particular complexion and design, but to think about how do the various development organizations in your community work more effectively together. Well, what we've done very quickly over the last 40 minutes has brought you through a very quick journey through what we think are the key issues in reimagining the future of a destination. One important consideration as we end is, how do you see managing the destination once you have carried out the necessary planning and engagement activities? We have to recognize that there is no magic management structure and model. One possible role of a destination organization could be in-place management. This is a concept well understood within the UK, and from our perspective is applicable within Asia. While placemaking establishes the overall planning and design directions for a destination, place management can be seen as a coordinated and multi-stakeholder approach to improving destinations. That sounds very complicated, but what it really means is bringing together the skills and experiences and resources of all of the stakeholders in reimagining the future. It's a complex process and involves a wide number of disciplines, and we've listed these in our slide, and I won't go through these, but I think they are evident. But very often the success of the planning and management process might involve dealing with issues that are not directly related to tourism, as we talked about earlier in our presentation. And so it's important to look at such things as economic and social problems. How does health affect the overall success of our destination? So again, it's enlarging the kind of people that we engage in our process and working with them in place management to work effectively together.
So you're probably asking yourself, what's next? We know the future is uncertain, especially longer term. What we have presented today are aspects to be considered as part of the larger planning and management of a destination. It is a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing the world, and utilizes this time to learn, improve, and act to make our destinations better, to be more sustainable, more economically sound, and provide more opportunities for the communities to thrive. While we'll wait to see a more definitive picture of what the new reality will be, destinations must begin to reimagine the future as they would like it to be, both in terms of their residents as well as the type of tourists that they would like to welcome into their destination. One of the things that we can be certain of is the fact that change is inevitable. So we need to operate within that reality. As we presented at the very beginning of the presentation, we have indicated that there are these key ideas that have been identified either as separate items or as cross-cutting themes. We would argue that all destinations must be resilient and sustainable. Their structures must be agile in helping to make decisions in an efficient way given market, social, and environmental changes. In a competitive world, we believe that innovation is essential. Approaches and solutions should be driven by accurate and synthesized data. Work should be done collaboratively to take a holistic approach without silos impeding change. Appropriate destination management structures must be adopted along with strategic thinking. And finally, destinations must learn how to deal with change and rapid change at that. And a clear vision is what is going to help guide these activities. Here we've just listed a number of resources and articles that Dr. Jameson and I and others have worked on that further explain some of the key areas that we have discussed today, and you'll be able to further explore these once you receive the presentation.
We'd like to thank you for your attention. We'd like to thank the organizers for asking us to share some ideas with you. We look forward to answering your questions, either here as part of the event or by email or other means. We're here to serve. We look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Okay, that was really intense, actually, and a quite incredible presentation. Yeah, I mean, it was so many questions that need to get answered, I think. But I will say this, that if you're in the destination management business and you're not thinking about these types of things, it's on you. This was really amazing. And I have a bunch of questions that I'd like to ask if you don't mind. And I'd like to start kind of with general questions because there was so much depth covered here. And I like to kind of simplify things and break it down. But I will say this too, that anybody who's watched this presentation, anybody who's watched this webinar should definitely take a look through those slides and run through them and think about exactly what they mean. Because if you're in the destination management business and you're not rethinking the way you look at these things, whether it's design thinking or place management or any of the things that you've mentioned, and you're not innovating, you're going to be left behind. You just are. I mean, I think this is true in every industry, but particularly true here because of what's happened over the past 5 or 6 months. I have a bunch of questions. Can we start with this one though? If I go through the presentation that you've given, the destination planning and destination management, very complex. You use that word a bunch of times. And in a bunch of different cases, you said, this sounds very complicated, and it is very complicated. And there are a bunch of different stakeholders too. So managing this is really hard, it seems to me. Let's just say, and I like to look at things this way sometimes, in like a one product universe, just to simplify it down. If I'm trying to create a new destination from scratch, and I loved that photo that you had of that street. I don't know where it was, not the one that was in Montreal, but the other one where there were two sort of diverging streets and a building in the middle, and then it had the tables there. They just, look, we're not going to make this a thoroughfare anymore. We're going to make it a place where people can sit and enjoy this sort of metropolitan area. But somebody had to come up with that idea. But there are so many different stakeholders there, right? There's public, there's private, there are the homeowners and the landowners and the shop owners there. I guess the question for me is, if we incorporate all of the ideas you mentioned, innovation, placemaking, complexity, design thinking, how would this really work in the real world, right? Can you just try to imagine a new destination, right? And any new place, whether it's in Bangkok or in Montreal or in New York, and say, what do we have to do to turn this place into a sustainable and well-managed destination? Like, can you just step through that? Is that okay to ask?
Sure. Let's assume then that this is a new place, but it has to have people living there of one kind or another. So I'm assuming a resident population, that
Sure.
there is a set of social and cultural connections between those people.
Right.
We mentioned stakeholder management very quickly, and and thank you, Michael, for saying that this is broad and complex. But one of the things that we typically don't do very well is spend any time understanding the people who are there before we even talk about tourism, right?
Right.
From my point of view, and work that Michelle and others have done, is that we almost assume that people want tourism. We never ask them, do you want tourism? What kind of tourism? How much tourism do you want? When do you want it? So that's our first step, is to not assume that people there want it and that it's on their terms.
Right.
So a good person who's really running a stakeholder management process would see that as an initial responsibility that she would have, is to begin to better understand the people that are there, then to find out what businesses are there, what are their hopes and aspirations as they relate to tourism, looking at nonprofit groups to see how they may benefit. So that's the first step. This is really not sexy. This is just a lot of time spent on the ground, going around, talking with people, having coffee and tea, and getting to better know the community. I always feel that once I've done that, you can then start to do planning, because up until then, I'm just listening.
Yeah.
And so I would say the next step then is to go through some kind of an inventory process with the community. And we've written books on this and manuals where the community itself goes out and assesses what they have. What do they think is important? What do they want to share with the tourist? Once they've done that, then professionals can move in and start to design and deal with these. But at this point, then, you know that the community is fully behind you in the approach you want to take. Then, I won't go on too long here, but then I think it's important that we then spend time, as we talked about in design thinking, of saying, what can we do? Let's try it. Let's try to see if this is going to work. Let's try the social media campaign. Let's try to see how we redesign a street. Let's try a street market. Let's try to find ways that we can do it, assess them before we do these big strategic plans. And I say this now as a planner who makes his life doing strategic plans and master plans, that in many cases, avoid the master plan for a while. Let it work, and then maybe after a period of time, you might be able to do it. But this is the last thing I was going to say, Michael, quickly, is that this is a long process, and people often try to work in 6 months. And our experience, it doesn't work that way. That to gain the confidence and trust of people to get things working can take a year or 2 years before you're actually ready to say we're in the tourism business.
I mean, look, I like to solve big problems in little increments, right? And I think that's part of what you're saying is don't try to solve the whole thing with one gigantic master plan. Do a little bit of testing along the way. And I love this idea of asking the local people, and again, whether it's a metropolitan area or a small town, and I'll give you a little bit of background. I grew up in a town called Nantasket Beach, Massachusetts. And during the summer, the town was a completely different place than it was during the winter. And actually, even some of the houses on S Street where I lived were uninhabited during the wintertime. And in the summertime, people from sort of the wealthier towns around Boston would come down to the beach. I never remember having, I mean, I was young, but I don't think there was any planning around that. People just bought a house there to rent it out. And yeah, there is this idea of, do we really want all these people coming into our town or our location? It's a great idea. But you said something, you both said something earlier that was interesting. Is you don't want to do these surveys necessarily. You should stop doing surveys, if I heard you correctly. But what kind of data, and I agree that it should be qualitative and not quantitative. We talked about this before. I'm indifferent to like 16 million visitors in the biggest tourist destination in the world, because that gets back to this concept of sustainability that you talked about. Like I was in Angkor Wat in 1990 or 1991, I can't remember. And I loved it because no one was there. But if 25 million people visit every year, it's just going to get destroyed, right? So you have to find the balance. But what kind of, I just made a note to myself, what kind of sort of qualitative data do we need to analyze when we talk about being data-driven? And how do we get this data? Because I think it's really important.
Yeah, Michael, I just wanted to underline something. When we start working in an area, I used to hire tourism planners because that's what we were doing.
Right.
And I found that very often tourism planners weren't the right people to start that process, and we use social workers. And I often use professional social workers who are used to dealing with communities. They know how to listen, they're sympathetic, they're not going to impose their view. And you know what was really interesting is that, at least in the beginning, they didn't know anything about tourism, which was a good thing. And so they weren't trying to steer things. But which is partly answering your question, is that very often the quality information we get is through a meeting with 4 or 5 people in the coffee shop, or in a church group, or in a mosque, or where we might meet with the imam and find out what's going on. And the imam usually would have a much better understanding of what's going on in his community. And so we also like the fact, though, of the group meetings, especially in Asia, but other places, tend to be dominated by the people with authority and knowledge. And so we try to steer away from those, of working especially with women's groups. We'll ask our female colleagues to go and sit down when they're sewing, or when they're weaving, or when they're doing something, and get them talking. What are the issues you're facing? How much tourism do you want? And I'll give you a quick example, Michael, if I might.
Tell me.
We were working in a community, and one of the things the headman and his henchmen came up with was a restaurant. And so they thought it was a great idea. So we said, we'll prototype, we'll run a restaurant for a day, and everyone will go. And we invited, foreigners and others into the process. And at the end of the day, I went with one of my Thai colleagues, and I said, that was a great thing, wasn't it? It worked really well. I was really enthused. I thought that was great. And she said, it was terrible. And I was devastated. Well, she said, now the men want us to cook and clean and plant the rice and harvest the rice and take care of the children. And now they want us to run a restaurant. And what she basically said is, we don't have the capacity. Right. If we didn't have that sidebar, we might do it with the restaurant, because the people in authority, together with the district council and others, thought it was a dynamite idea.
Right.
Well, we really think that qualitative information is really important. But just, what we like to say is, the community better off after tourism? Is it better off?
Right.
Do school children now have money to buy school uniforms and buy lunch in Thailand? Do young women now have choices that are not restricted in terms of what they might do in the future?
Right.
How much money are they making? Are they able to support their families through working in a hotel, which they couldn't do before? What happens to kids who have social problems, behavioral problems? Can tourism actually help to solve those? And we have good examples where good people running tourism programs have helped to deal with that. That's the kind of qualitative information we want. We want to know that the place is better than it was before, not that it had more tourists.
Right. So I like this comment that both of you made, that experiences rarely just happen, right? And you don't want to make it feel planned. You want to make it feel spontaneous, and it's much more fun that way. But it does have to be planned, particularly at the local level. But part of that experience, I think, is, and you said local before too, I think for me, whenever I travel, I think part of that local experience is trying to understand not just the monument that you're looking at or the building that you're seeing, but what are the people in that area really doing? How do they really live? Because I think the world is consumed by what I used to call the other side of the mountain syndrome. And what that means is that, and I use this in the context of the Japanese warring periods, right? Sengoku Jidai, yeah? So the Japanese warring state periods. And what it meant was that if you lived on the other side of the mountain, by definition, you were scary. And what people found is when they went to the other side of the mountain, those people weren't scary. They were just making rice and trying to feed their families just like you were. And I think that tourism has the opportunity to bring people together that feel like there may be opposing cultures or different cultures. But the reality is that if you can bring those people together in good experiences, right? Like you said, these local experiences that are well planned but feel spontaneous, what you do is you eliminate people's feelings of those people must be bad. And you know, in the early 90s, when we started traveling, I say me, in Asia, I had experiences that I had never conceived before. And it opened up my mind to a different way of thinking about different cultures. And this gets back to the sustainability as well. I want to understand from a planning perspective, and Michelle, maybe you can talk about this a little bit too, is how do you encourage people that are planning? And this is, the restaurant was a perfect example of this, right? For working with women and children and these sort of underserved groups locally to make their lives better and more sustainable when you talk about bringing tourism into those locations.
I mean, sort of going back to a little bit of what you said earlier, we're really always looking at the people and how it's connected back to the place. And so that's done with storytelling. But part of it is also interpretation. So a lot of places have a ton of tangible heritage that is very easy to explain and sort of curate in terms of an experience. The rest of it's intangible. And so when we look at a destination, it's really trying to identify what those intangible pieces of the heritage are. And I think storytelling is one of those things that can be done visually. It can be done through either the food or art, culture, a number of different ways. And so, you know, that's really one of the biggest things. I might let Dr. Jameson speak to some of his experiences just in terms of actually making sure that the positive impacts are being felt within the communities.
You know, one of the things that we face often in tourism is that, and I know that in your work you would appreciate this, is that a country will typically want to invite people into the country because of foreign exchange earners, that tourism is an export industry. And, you know, we don't invite people into Thailand or Malaysia just because we want people to come in, because there's going to be an economic benefit from doing this.
Sure.
And one of the things that often isn't mentioned in this whole quantitative discussion is how much money actually stays in the country, but more importantly, how much money stays in a destination. And if you really think about it, you know, if you take Bangkok, of course, quite a bit of the money stays in Bangkok. But once you move away from Bangkok and you start to think about what is the tourism, the tourists consuming, it's really frightening. And I'll just, again, use a story. When I was doing the tourism plan for Cambodia, we were sitting in the Raffles Hotel in Siem Reap with the GM and the Minister of Tourism. And I was trying to get this idea across, and we call it leakage. How much money leaks out of the community? And I wasn't getting anywhere. So then I said, well, let's look around the table. And so I said, where do the fruits come from? Thailand. Where the dishes come from? Thailand. Where does the rice come from? Thailand. All because of production issues and supply chains. Well, I said, where does the table come from? Well, most of the things that were there that were being paid for by the tourism dollar were actually leaving the country.
Right.
But they were certainly leaving the destination. And so we always try to think about the fact, what kind of experiences are we going to design, curate, that's going to ensure that the money stays in the community? I.e., local food, local women cooking the food, or local people cooking the food. And so that's a real challenge we have. And so, when I hear ministers of tourism saying tourism, has gone up by, 8% and we have 36 million, that doesn't mean a thing. But
Doesn't mean anything.
Okay, we had this, but you know what? We now have kids that, in terms of money we've kept, are able to go to school and get their school uniform and buy lunch.
Right.
That to me is it's staying in the community. But when I go to a 5-star hotel that's internationally owned, and I have, wonderful Australian beef and French wines and whatever else, none of that money stays in the country. We have to understand that it leaves. And so, when we're trying to think about numbers, maybe we're looking at smaller numbers, but of tourists that are going to buy locally, spend locally, and support the local ecosystem, as opposed to making, some hotel companies richer than before.
Yeah, and let me give you my example of this, and let me maybe you can confirm this for me. So let's say you're a country that's like getting wealthier and wealthier, so your citizens are now traveling more and more globally. And let's say you come to a country like Thailand and you buy a hotel. Let's say you buy more than one. And then let's say you buy a shopping mall. So this is foreign owned, right? And then let's say you fly on your country's airline into Thailand. You get on a bus with tour people hired from your country. You take them to a shopping mall where all of the stores are owned by that country, but they're in Thailand, yeah? You feed them Thai food at restaurants that are owned by your country, and then you take them to a hotel. This is what you're talking about. And then when that tour is done, those people have satisfied their desire to have been in Thailand because they've driven around Bangkok or gone to Phuket or done whatever. And then they leave and they fly home. The country benefits zero from this because all of that money is then being repatriated back to whatever that country is. Let's just call it country X. How do you fix that?
That's the $0 tourist, right?
Exactly.
That's the $0, and
you talk about this because it hits on every point that you're trying to make, right?
Yeah.
It's not sustainable. There are too many people coming. They're not really governed by local authorities because they almost like come in and go through their whole own route and then leave, and none of the money kind of stays in the country because the investors that built that whole route take most of that money and repatriate it or just reinvest it in that thing. So how do you fix that?
Yeah, and but just to say too, Michael, the really discouraging thing about this is that often that package tourist, that mass tourist, leaves Thailand or Cambodia or wherever, not understanding the place they've been. They've been to a number of attractions. They got their picture taken and then they leave. And so the country doesn't even benefit from being able to talk about its culture and its values and its way of life.
Right.
That somebody else is doing it, the foreign tour.
Whatever.
And that's why Michelle and I are so keen on reimagining. What you really want a destination to be. If you really want to solve a problem, right now we don't have enough money to fix our roads, and the kids we don't have a high school.
Right.
Then what kind of tourism will help you to do that? Which will generate the kind of funds that you need, the kind of support, because we also have to think about the fact that tourism also has this halo effect, that if you're doing it properly, you might get donations, you might get support from corporate or individuals that will help you with your school. And so that's why we keep coming back to the fact that if you're doing tourism in order to provide a better quality of life to the people in the community, then their next question is, how do we do that? And one way, obviously, is locally owned, locally managed approaches. And the most promising thing that's happening from my point of view is the whole idea of the social enterprise, the social enterprise, which are growing all over Asia, but I know of Thailand in a much better way, where you say, look, we're going to run a restaurant, but the benefits are going to go to the local community, or women or orphans. And that is an interesting business model. It's not private, it's not public, but it's saying, are there ways that we can generate the kind of income we need without the kind of issues that you've been identifying,
right,
and at the same time provide for a better quality of life for the people in that community? If what we do is encourage mass tourism, which raises rents, raises the cost of food, increases congestion, increases pollution, that's hardly going to increase the quality of life of local people, right?
Yeah, but it's also going to make that tourism experience worse. I mean, I'd love it if you could give an example of something in Thailand or in Southeast Asia on the social innovation side, something that's very important to me. I do my own show on social innovation, and I've spoken to a bunch of people in the space. I think the world is moving into this secular change of where profit maximization, which gets taught to MBA students as the holy grail for any business, is actually going to be wrong. And I think that part of that is that you have to have this benefit to society as well. In other words, you can still make a profit and give back to your community where you're making that profit. And I think that that's going to become really important. Yeah. And we haven't even hit on this idea of over-tourism. You've mentioned it. But I always wonder how to find that balance. And I think the social innovations will help that. But I also want to ask you about public-private partnerships that encourage that type of balance. What type of partnerships need to get formed? Is it just the tourism, the tourism agency talking to the hotel? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. Let me use an example, which I like. It's a little bit old now.
No, it's fine.
But it was in Siem Reap, and 2 Thai investors built 2 hotels in Siem Reap, and one of them was called the Shintamani. And the vice president of the company at that point was Canadian Bill Black. And what the investors said is, where are we going to get the chefs from? This is many years ago. And there weren't any chefs, and people didn't want to go to Siem Reap. And they said, you know what we'll do? We'll set up a culinary school, a cooking school, and we'll work with local agencies dealing with kids with drug problems or family abuse or whatever, but at-risk kids. So you find those kids for us, and then we'll bring them into our training program for 9 months, and we'll teach them how to cook. But it wasn't really cooking; it was life skills, discipline, whatever. Well, and they were very difficult. I mean, they said, if you don't show up, if you don't abide by the rules, you're out. Well, most kids stayed in, and for many years they turned out really good people. And the best story was when the average wage in Siem Reap might have been $30 or $40 a month. Before long, one of the women that graduated from the program was making $250 a month.
Right.
So that was a partnership. It was a partnership between the charity and the hotel. Now, the hotel supplied the chef and they supplied the space. And they also supplied the food. And so the people would say, well, I can't afford to go to the school because I have to feed my family. So they said, okay, here's a bag of rice. And then they would say, well, we can't get there. And they said, well, here's a bicycle. And they did that with sewing machines and other things. But it was really a way of taking some of their profit, which was a wonderful thing, and building it in. But what did they do? People then started to stay at Shintamani because you felt good. You felt that not only were you having a great time, but you left the destination in a better place because of what you had done. And I agree with you. I think people want that opportunity. They want to feel that they are contributing to the place in which they are visiting.
Yeah, I think most tourists actually are benevolent. I don't think they want to just run roughshod over the locations where they go. I think they want to preserve it, and I use Angkor Wat as a good example. And by the way, I stayed at the Raffles Hotel when it just opened back in 1998, or I can't remember what year it was. But yeah, very nice place. But I think people want to leave it in a place that's either the same or better so that their kids and their grandkids can go back and see it. Because some of these places will blow you away. Like, I've never been to Machu Picchu, but I have to imagine it's inspiringly beautiful. Nobody wants to just run over it, right? And I always feel better when you're laughing at me. I don't know why, but I always feel better when I can give money. Money's the wrong word, but when I can provide resources to people directly, right? So the example you gave of the hotel and the chefs is the perfect example, right? If you can go from making $30 a month to $250 a month, it gets all the way back to this thing you talked about with sustainability and helping the local population. And that has to be, as a tourist, right? You can go home and not think, I just saw the Eiffel Tower and took a picture there, but I've actually contributed. So my hard work in New York or in Tokyo or in London has now contributed to something in Cambodia or Siem Reap. Yeah. That feels so much better.
Absolutely.
Part of that needs to be done through education for the tourists, because as
Absolutely.
much as they believe that some of their contributions to certain parts of the tourism industry are making a difference,
Right.
I think a lot of them just don't understand that the circular economy does not necessarily mean that it's actually making the difference that they feel it might be. So
yeah, agreed.
We need to work on how we're able to communicate that with our tourists, especially from a destination level.
And is there a difference between, sorry, I have more questions. Is that okay? Is there a difference between, are we running out of time?
We got all the time in the world.
Okay, as long as Sukmay doesn't tell me to stop, I'm not stopping. Is there a major difference between sort of metropolitan tourism, meaning coming to Bangkok or going to New York City, in the concept of sustainability or the other things that we discussed today, or going to a more rural place where the infrastructure may not be able to handle? You talked about capacity, right?
Yeah, clearly, urban tourism is its own field, the methodologies. The thing with urban tourism, and this is where the complexity thing comes in, that if you're working in a provincial town or a provincial destination, the decision maker is 1 minute away, or in trying to get a decision in a place like Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur is very difficult.
Yeah.
And so, but this is again where we begin to think about, and you were saying this earlier, of the small scale. Good example in Thailand, in Bangkok, is there's this woman whose name is Porn, and Kun Porn runs a culinary school in one of the slum areas
Awesome.
of Thailand, and she has become so famous that Jamie Oliver has had her on, and she's now become a star. But what she did is she, out of a very simple place, ran a cooking school and employed the women in the area.
Right.
Went to the local market and bought the stuff in the local market. Everything stayed within the local community. And so if we start to think in that way, if we start to think that every part of that experience, rather than taking them to a fancy dancy cooking school,
Yeah.
to the slum and finding out just where this food came from originally. And this woman is, it's got an incredible personality. Or who runs the tours? Do we go, do we have a fancy dancy tour guide, or do we train local people to become the guides and help them get money, feel pride, be able to walk back into their community with a sense of pride that they now have a uniform? Think about the incredible impact that we have. And so we always like to say that we should be hiring and training locally. If you open a hotel, don't immediately think we're going to bring everyone from out of town.
Right.
I'm training the local people who are more than capable of working in the hotel. It may take some time. Service may not be always as good as we want it, but that money stays there. When that young lady becomes a chambermaid in Cambodia, her family is out of poverty. Not she. Her family is out of poverty.
Yeah, exactly.
Thinking again, the way you do it, that you would encourage companies to hire locally, purchase locally, run your gift shop, have your gift shop run by a local charity, of which there are many, many in all the countries.
Right.
Who would love to be able to have their goods in the hotel lobby, in the gift shop.
Right.
All of that is community-based, and you're thinking, again, out of the box. It's much more difficult. And one last quick thing is the encouragement of urban agriculture is something that's growing very quickly in the United States and Canada. And this idea now that we can actually start to grow certain kinds of things within the city itself. Singapore is doing it, and other places are doing it.
Yeah.
But being able to turn this over and saying to the poor communities, we're going to help set up an urban hydroponic farm for you where you can grow salad for the hotels and restaurants or whatever it happens to be. That's the development part of tourism that you're thinking about. How do we make it better as opposed to buying it from the large wholesaler who may be foreign owned?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I won't even talk to you about the restaurant that I was in yesterday and just how terrible of an experience it was. Look, one of the things that I always thought was interesting was the training program that was done at the Oriental. Now, I know the Oriental's a fancy hotel in Bangkok, but my understanding always was that there was it was rated the best hotel in the world for years. And I think part of the reason why was maybe some of the things that you're saying, unless I misunderstand. They took local people, they trained them really well. And a lot of those people, like you said, if you train those people really well, their families, and I love this concept, their families actually move out of poverty. And I'll give you a perfect example. Okay, and this is weird, right, in a way, because we would go to the Oriental, sit around the pool, whatever. I know it's a little bit fancy. And I had a 2-year-old daughter, a 3-year-old daughter, whatever, because we went there a bunch of times. And the staff there, when we went back to Tokyo, would send her gifts.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, just think about that as a concept, though. In other words, they're so far removed now from the poverty. They've been so well trained, and that's a great thing, that they had enough resources to then buy like a Thai coloring book and send it to my daughter, Kyla. That blew me away.
Yeah, of course, it's an incredible hotel, and the GM that ran it for 30 years, best GMs anywhere in the world, right?
In the world, by far, yeah.
But and Kurt did a great job. But one of the companies that I think practices more what I think I would view as sustainable is Banyan Tree. Banyan Tree, was started by Asians, and so that's an important part of it, right?
Very.
And so when P. Ho and his brother and his wife started this, and from the very beginning, Banyan Tree had community responsibility as built right into what they were doing.
Yeah.
If you look at the programs that Banyan Tree runs at all of its brands, they have significant impact. But one important factor too with Banyan Tree is that I remember KP Ho at a meeting years ago saying, how come we only see white GMs? And how come we don't see Asians? And one of the things that he has been very influential in doing is saying, how do we remove that ceiling so that as an Asian, I only can go so far and then a European takes over? And so KP,
somebody from Switzerland,
Yeah, and so I think that's part of it again, is demonstrating to this young person who then might go back to school and get a high school and maybe even a university education. But they know when they get into the company, they're probably not going to become a GM.
Which is terrible.
And so I think part of it then is a responsibility to train, to support, and Banyan Tree's got an incredible corporate training program. They have an academy. And I think that those kinds of strategies are important so that as a young, bright, graduate of a university in Thailand from a poor family, I could become GM. And, the American story, and you know it better than I do, is that happens all the time, or used to happen all the time.
Sure, it used to, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's important. And so I think it's also, how do we help that wonderful waiter or waitress or front office person to move up and become a supervisor and maybe a manager, and not to bring in the young person from Switzerland who's not going to run the front desk because he is considered to have better skills, hospitality skills.
Absolutely. So I'm being told that we are running out of time, and it's too bad too, because you segued perfectly without knowing what my last question was going to be, but maybe we'll save this for next time because I'm being told to slow down. But next time I want to cover some of these. I loved this slide that you talked about key competencies, the technical competency, right? The soft management competency, the interdisciplinary perspective. And I wanted to cover that a little bit, but let's leave that for next time. Let me just thank both of you. This was amazing, really amazing. And hopefully you can tell that I'm very interested in this, and I think the audience would be very interested in this as well. It was great to have this conversation with you. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much for your questions.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Michael, Professor Walter, and Michelle for joining us today. It was a pleasure indeed. Professor Walter and Michelle are open to answer any offline questions too. Please feel free to email the Secretariat. Thank you for watching Expert Insight at Live. If you like what you have seen, subscribe to Convex Hub channel. Do switch on the notification and get notified on our Expert Insight at Live on-demand videos. Follow us on our LinkedIn page, FB page, and Twitter for more interesting episodes and topics on market, policy, strategy, technology, and innovation in your economic sector that have steered the industry growth. Coming up next, how would blockchain technology impacting supply chain management? July 29, 2020, 2 p.m.